Hello, this is your Freethinkers Report for 21st of October. I'm Greg Moffat of LegalizeFreedom.com, and today I'm speaking with Joe Hodgson, who is the son of Ocean, who is the founder of the Freethinkers Group and is behind the Freethinkers channel here on YouTube. So, hello Joe, welcome to the channel. I think it's your first time being on. Today we're going to speak about your personal awakening journey. Now that'll mean different things to different people listening to this, whether they feel that they've had one or not. Perhaps you'd just like to open by saying, we know you're son of Ocean, but just saying a little bit about yourself, and then maybe you can tell us about the arc of your life so far and what you consider to be awakening, and then just tell us about the journey that you've been on so far.
Yeah, sure. Hi, thank you for having me on this. I'm currently living in London, and for the most part, together with my friends and my family, I've been a pretty liberal person. I've kind of flip-flopped around in terms of, wondering whether to vote Conservative, Labour, sometimes Lib Dem. But I've been pretty run-of-the-mill over the years, and you wouldn't have thought of me as a kind of a right-wing conspiracy theorist in any way. When Brexit happened, I was pretty shocked by that. I went walking in London to say that I wanted, to be back in the EU or to not leave the EU, and I also was very kind of upset when Obama left office after his 8 years, and then Trump came in. So for the large part, I would say I probably had a similar mindset to majority of people around me, had sort of a similar groupthink, the similar ideals, looking back sort of 2016 time and before. Possibly the only difference that I would say I had is that when it came down to 9/11, and I think you might know a lot about that, but for me, I'd seen a post back in 2007. I got sent on Facebook a post by a friend that had shown that what looked to be categorical evidence that the towers had fallen by demolition, by controlled demolition, and I was looking at those videos and thinking, something's not quite right here. So I kind of looked at that. I didn't investigate it too much, but for a large part, I think, for 9/11, I felt there was something not quite right about that official story. But for a lot of other things, I was pretty much on the same mindset, I would say. So looking back to 2016, I just wanted to put that into context, because when it came down to the following years after the tumultuous year of 2016, I kind of started to ask a lot of people, like some people online who had voted Trump, some people within England, especially in the north of England, including my relation that had voted for Brexit. And I was asking questions, and I wanted to know more. Why did they do that? And I wasn't interrogating them, but I wanted to understand. And I guess it took maybe a couple of years of kind of trying to understand their mindset. Why did more people vote for Brexit than, I know it was close, but than for staying in the EU? Why did more people vote for Donald Trump than for Hillary Clinton? And as I kind of thought about this for probably the next couple of years, 2017, 2018, I guess it was probably early 2019 when I started to look around on a few YouTube videos, and I know people do, they go down to rabbit holes and they look at one YouTube video and then look at another one, and I started to go around a few YouTube videos, and something just did not make sense about the world we lived in. There was something that wasn't quite right. Something didn't quite fit, and my journey, I guess, started there. It was a bit of a light bulb moment, I think, sort of around March 2019, when I had this moment where I just felt something wasn't quite right, and ever since then, I've just been going more and more down this kind of alternative narrative, as it were, really starting to unpick what I thought was back then possibly I don't know, some sort of infiltration into why the 9/11 story could still make sense as being, a terrorist attack, but there may have been some infiltration into America that explains some of the anomalies that I was feeling. But this kind of exploded, and the more I dug into it, the more and more I realized that we've basically been told for large part quite a lot of lies about. Firstly, about key events in history, whether it's even the world wars and how they started, and even to my extent right now, who even won those wars. I mean, that's still to me a question that's worth asking now, given how things have panned out, especially the Second World War. We can maybe touch on that a bit later, but yeah, I guess that's the kind of the history of me up until I guess early last year, when I started to, as they say, become red pilled. I don't think I got black pilled, but I have read lots that's quite disturbing.
Can I ask what age you are, because that helps to put this in context?
Sure. Well, I'm currently 38, so yeah. Sort of moving into sort of mid-30s, I guess, when I started to wake up.
Yeah, because I asked this mainly in the context of 9/11, because many of the conversations I have with people who fall into one of two categories. Those who truly lived through 9/11, I don't mean those who were necessarily just alive when it happened, but those who were conscious enough to have some awareness or understanding of what they were seeing.
Yeah.
So it was a very pivotal moment. It changed my consciousness for sure, and I think it did that on a global basis. So I'm not at all surprised that you hark back to that as maybe the beginning of something. And I think, again, it was for a lot of people. You also...
Yeah, I mean, I've always been quite questioning of things, but somehow with my level of intrigue and want to know more, I desperately don't understand how I missed so much until only a couple of years ago with regards to the globalist movement, and how where looking back I did feel that they were a force for good, that they were the reason why the world hasn't gone into world war, and the reason why we are able to live with our with our mobile phones, with the internet, and there was a real sense of trust in the globalist side, but now I see it very differently.
Well, prior to the internet, of course, disseminating information that deviated from official narratives, government versions of things, disseminated through the mainstream media, it was rather difficult to do. If you look back in history, some of the alternative media and alternative thinkers, people with different views of history, good and bad, but they got their message out through writing books, and then as into the 80s and the 90s, they would make videos that you could buy, send off for VHS cassettes and things. So it was difficult for them to reach a global audience, and the internet changed that, of course, again, for better or worse, because as the internet grew, it became what it is now, which is like a free-for-all. I don't mean it's not heavily censored, restricted, controlled. It is in certain ways, but equally anybody can put an opinion up there, and if it stays up long enough, then it could potentially reach the entire world. So
we're definitely seeing a lot of censorship right now, but I certainly agree that it was, for the most part, probably YouTube where I was able to discover a sort of an alternative information. Certainly, actually, when it started, March, in terms of thinking that something wasn't quite right, a lot of it was down to videos that were made on various megalithic sites all around the world. Like, obviously, there's pyramids, but then there's Göbekli Tepe and Chichen Itza and Machu Picchu, and all these magnificent architectural discoveries that, for the most part, are little. There's little known about them, And when you dive deeper into understanding them, you see that there's a richer history to humanity that we've been told. And I think that's where things started to tick for me when I realised that this does not make sense under the existing narrative of the kind of the hunter-gatherer, then 6,000 years ago on the Fertile Crescent, started to develop language and art and music almost miraculously. I think that for me was where I started to think there's something not quite right about what we're taught about humanity, and then that kind of went off into the UFO and Roswell side of things, and I was starting to listen to stories about the Roswell crash and the cover-up, and then it got into the military-industrial complex and all the money that got siphoned off into Black Ops projects, and it just exploded from there, to be honest. But that's kind of, it was those YouTube videos that I saw of architectural discoveries and reading about these things with Graham Hancock and a few other books, Eric Von Daniken as well. Two great books there, that Fingerprints of the Gods and the name escapes me, but Eric Chariots, is it Chariots of the Gods?
Chariots of the Gods, yeah. I mean, Von Daniken's been widely debunked, and by that I mean, I'm not saying that everything he said was without foundation, but the reason I mention it is a lot of people consider his work to be, have been exposed as false. Basically, he's falsifying a lot of stuff and misinterpreting a lot of stuff. But
I think misinterpreting is probably a better way of putting it. And I've heard similar things, but yeah.
But for the purposes of the conversation we're having, what Von Daniken did, he's a perfect example of a type of individual that I mentioned before, a type of researcher who, his books were bestsellers, but in pre-internet era, he had to publish his thoughts, his research, his findings, his investigations, and he may well have, and now he's adapted well to the internet era. But 9/11 was a bit of a tipping point in terms of the nexus between growing distrust for the public with official narratives and the availability of alternative interpretations. So you had one of the biggest world events ever, particularly like a one-off, one-day event, 9/11, and a burgeoning internet. So these two things intersected, and that's why it was such a big point for so many people. But of course, prior to that, not only could people not find or not easily find alternative versions of history or economics, politics, just different ways of looking at the world. They had been steeped in official narratives and mainstream media all their lives, and told to trust these sources, and that's what they learned. All of their view of the world was formed, partly by their parents, of course, and their social circle, their society. But again, it was like who was controlling the flow of information. So, and that's gradually began to morph and change. And so we find ourselves now at a time never more fluid in terms of different ideas about people, places, and events, what's going on. For any given event, I think, or trend, or whatever it happens to be, you can find 1,001 or more interpretations. So again, and that's good and bad. I think it's good in the sense that anybody is free to give put their view out there. If not bad, then it's complicated by the fact that how on earth can you sift that matrix of information? How on earth can you wade through that and come to any kind of conclusion? And I think that even now, when people ask, how can so many people think that government always has their best interests at heart and that the mainstream media would never lie to them? How do they still think that? It's probably because of the cognitive dissonance caused by the events they see with their own eyes unfolding in the world in their daily lives, not matching up with official narratives, and the fact that we look for simple answers and simple stories. That's always been the case, and even now with all these alternatives, people still want to just say, they say to themselves, they cry out for, just tell me please what's happening. just so I can sleep at night. They still want that boiled down version.
I think we're born or into a world where, from a very early age, we're told to accept authority figures, whether it's the teacher in the school, the parent, then all the way through into the world of work. We're told that there is a authority figure that we should listen to and trust in terms of getting information. And I think that so from a very early age, we're told not really to think for ourselves so much, but to delegate some of that thinking, critical thinking, to other authorities. And when it comes to science, we delegate that to scientists. When it comes to our health, we delegate that to hospitals and doctors and nurses. And I do think an aspect of the awakening is not just to discover that these authority figures haven't had our best interests at heart, have been lying to us and possibly doing more harm than good, but also it's a way of understanding our own intuition and building up our own sense of who we are and really trusting ourselves and our discernment of the reality we live in. I think you said it very well, that we've got this wealth of information, a lot of it conflicts with each other. How do you navigate through that? And being able to do that, I think part of the awakening is trusting your own story. You are almost like the co-creator of your life, and or the co-creator of humanity, and you are part of your own story. And it's like we're living through a movie right now when I look at it. But we are co-creating this reality, and it's part of the awakening is is the discernment and to understand the power we have within that.
Yes, and everything that you mentioned with regard to trusting your instinct, or at least examining your instinct, examining what your sixth sense is telling you, what your inner feelings about something. We're very much discouraged from doing that, have been for a long time. We defer to experts, and sometimes there's a good reason for that, sometimes there isn't. In the context of the situation we find ourselves in now, this pandemic crisis of 2020, one of the things that one of the memes I've seen very commonly online has been mocking people for quote unquote doing their own research, laughing at the idea that you or I or any other non-expert in some of these fields can have anything useful to say or to offer in terms of how to deal with what we're facing. Now, yeah, I'm not talking about developing a vaccine for COVID-19. You and I don't, as far as I know, you don't have the skills to do that. I don't. That's not the point. But I'm just talking about the situation we find ourselves in. So that's reaching sort of fever pitch now, I think, because 9/11 was. I mean, I saw so many people looking for alternative sources of information after 9/11. That cognitive dissonance that I mentioned, they were feeling that very strongly. They were looking for another story. They knew there was something not right here. Now, as someone who lived through 9/11, all I can say is that what's happening now is just put that into the shade utterly. So people are feverishly now looking for some alternative story, whether within themselves or without, because they know, whether they admit it or not, they know intuitively, instinctively. I think if people listening to this, I think if you, in the small hours, in the dark, if you look into the depths of your heart, your soul, your intellect, there's something not quite right in what's been presented to you here. And so people are looking for the truth elsewhere. If truth can be a slippery concept, but I don't
like to say the word truth and believe a lot. I like to
because it's religious connotations. You either don't believe anything, you either know something or you don't, and on that basis we know nothing. But nevertheless, they're seeking something, and I think most people fall into that category at the moment. And you're a good example of someone who's been on a journey over a period of time, which is ongoing. But of course, as usual, just as when people were questioned in polls prior to the election of Donald Trump, who are you going to vote for? They lied to pollsters. People who voted Trump were also amongst the least likely to respond to polls. the same situation applied for people who voted for Brexit. They were least likely to reply to polls, or they were more likely to lie, more likely to say what they thought the pollster and the media who were going to cover the polls wanted to hear. So I think the same applies right now with regard to the pandemic situation and the wake of that, the ensuing economic, social and cultural mayhem. Most people, when questioned, will say, no, what's happening is what needs to happen. The governments are doing what needs to be done. There's a pandemic after all. And I think a hell of a lot of those people have got some serious doubts and serious questions that they want answers to.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, and I'm not sure to what degree polls are accurate. I think it's the same subsample because I've never really been polled, but I think you're right in terms of saying that when given a question, it's like in any conversation, you try and read who the other person is, what their beliefs are, and you try and tailor your the way you word things to make that conversation as good as possible in terms of not having any friction there. So I think we all have this natural ability to sort of try and tailor what we say to meet the needs of whoever's asking us questions. So maybe there is some truth that when polled and by mainstream media, there is a kind of a tendency to go along with the mainstream media, even if you have a lot of doubts. So yeah, that could explain to a certain extent why the polls have got it so wrong.
Well, we have a tendency towards conformity, which is inculcated in us, as you mentioned, starting at school. We want to fit in. We desperately want to fit in, and this is what a lot of social engineering relies on. It's peer pressure. It's you don't want the disapproval of your community, and so you'll do whatever it takes to avoid that. You don't want to become a pariah.
Yeah, but I think as part of my I'd say awakening journey, if you will, was to become more sovereign as a being and to be a bit more conscious of my own truth, my own path. I think it's a very powerful thing that I wish on everybody, to be honest. The awakening journey can be quite a powerful and quite a spiritual thing for a lot of people. I find that listening to a lot of people on various podcasts, YouTube videos, it seems, and this might be a slight tangent, but there's two roads to the awakening. There's the people who were very much watching a lot of stuff about conspiracy and getting very involved into understanding that, and then at some point they kind of became more spiritual. And I think there were other people who were very spiritually minded, and at some point along the line they started to understand a deeper truth about reality and get into more on that, what we call the conspiracy world. The real conspiracy, in my view, is actually what's been going on, within the Democrat Party right now in America, and what's going on there. So an odd word to use, but just looking back, and I'd like to sort of think about Ocean, who you mentioned is my father. He was very much went down the spiritual path, and further down the line he woke up a bit more to the deep state and all this. Whereas what was my journey has been the other way around. Oddly, I was definitely learning about the other narrative and the deep state and all this before, I'd say early this year, when my focus has become more about my own spiritual journey, trying to connect my head and my heart, which is to kind of be less in the mind and more in the heart, my heartfelt with your intentions, but also this aspect of the awakening is to understand this. Have you heard about the ascension process, or the awakening from 3D to 5D? Is that something you're familiar with? I don't know if the listeners are familiar with that, but it's a huge topic, and I think this is something that is really happening. I feel it sometimes. I've had experiences in the last few months which are kind of odd, but make me feel that there is definitely something going on collectively within our consciousness, an upgrade, it seems, going on within the collective consciousness of us all on Earth, as we all awaken. I definitely feel it. I can definitely feel a big change going on right now, all the way through 2020, and it's getting bigger and bigger.
Well, I feel like the evolution of consciousness is the purpose of existence, the purpose of the universe. So it's just a question of what that looks like, and to what, is there any end to that? Is there any purpose, meaning? And then what, in terms of the events that we experience in our reality, what serves that evolution and what does not? So that's, and it's kind of answering your question about am I familiar with this, the ascension idea? I am. I don't think that I would express it in the same term. I know I wouldn't in the same terms that the ocean does, but that's not important. The point is that there is a natural teleology here. Something is happening, and overall, there's a process, but right now it does feel particularly significant. And I know that's a common theme in human history. Lots of human civilizations, global or otherwise, felt that they were living at a significant time in history. But maybe that's because they were. Maybe all of it is significant. It certainly is on some level. But the narrow window of Earth history that you and I have experienced, what has gone before this point certainly feels like just a precursor, really, to what could happen from this point onward. So it does feel like an inflection point. There's no question about that. Whether it's of the historical significance that some people feel, we have no way of knowing at the moment. Again, it comes back down to intuition and instinct.
Yeah, it's very surreal, sort of living right now in this world where you can go online and you can think, you can read about or listen to podcasts talking about other worlds and other various beings out there that are watching over us, or talking about the ascension process, the upgrade of consciousness, and also on the other side about the layers of corruption that are inside the governments and institutions, and the almost unilateral global takeover that's sort of happening right now. There's this whole world of stuff, and then you turn that off and you go on with your day-to-day world, and it all seems pretty kind of normal. You go again on with the day-to-day. It's kind of quite a surreal existence at the moment. But my intuition does tell me that we are in this, as you say, a good word, nexus point. I know Ocean talks about these two different timelines, and we're at this point where we all see a merging of all the different timelines into one, and that one is, he calls it this sort of the peace. I think it's the peaceful timeline and the Armageddon one. But yeah, he talks about a high probability of going down the good timeline, as we like to call it, and not the Armageddon one, which I think that's true. But right now we're in this kind of weird holding pattern. For me, it's all about the election. I think for me, now that I've become more awake, I'm very much wanting Donald Trump to win, if not closely, but by a landslide if possible. And I think a Biden win for me will inevitably lead to a takeover of America by China, because I think that's what Biden is a puppet of, CCP, and that's deeply concerning, because I think that America does feel like the last bastion of freedom. If we ever, if that route happened, what would happen to the rest of the world, and would there be anywhere to go if that did happen? That these are just thoughts that I do have, but at the moment I am very much on the more positive timeline, and I do hope that's the way. But we're definitely in this kind of weird, surreal moment right now, seeing what happens.
Yeah, your professed hope that Trump wins, obviously that's not exactly what it appears to be at first glance. It's not to do with Republican or Democrat or right wing or left wing. It's to do with these overall global trends that we're talking about. Well, it may be one of the reasons, from my perspective, that the pandemic crisis was brought forward, was that the Trump's election in the US and the Brexit vote in the UK were anti-globalization movements, if you see what I mean. They were putting, potentially, depending on your interpretation, but they were putting a certain agenda into reverse in two very key territories on this planet. So I think it was panic station for some people. It was pull the trigger. And, something had to be done, basically, in short order, because the sentiments that led to the election of Trump and also to the Brexit vote have been mirrored in a lot of other places as well. You can look at secessionist movements and independence movements in lots of parts of the world with a very similar flavour to them. I think that was something that some people felt had to be not nipped in the bud. It's a bit too late for that, but had to be stopped before it gained too much further momentum.
Yeah, I mean, you've pointed out that I think what you said is that COVID was an organised, orchestrated thing. It's been in the planning for years. Was it potentially meant to happen now? I'm not sure, but certainly the Trump election and Brexit were definitely something that went completely against the plans that have been going back for decades. I think the plan was that Hillary would come in after Obama, and within the next 8 years we would see the huge changes that would have probably manifested possibly already in terms of how things would have worked out had the globalists have got their way. But luckily by fingernail we as humanity have managed to escape what could have been, and now we're at the moment where we could go through the next few years to expose all the corruption and have planetary freedom from what is quite an evil, corrupt, controlled system. Or is it alien? I'm not sure, but it's definitely it knows how to control humanity, and whatever the system is ultimately, it is extremely clever at manipulating us and social engineering and getting us to think in one way, and that was a very dangerous road we're on without realizing it, and just hopefully I'll look back and think, oh my goodness, how lucky we are to be in this free world right now when we could have had things very differently. So yeah, it's there's a lot of thoughts there.
Well, when it came down to the final stages of the last US presidential election cycle just before Trump won, and when it came to the last days of the Brexit campaign as well, the polls were telling us that Clinton was going to win, as you say, and that there's no way that the Leave vote was going to win Brexit. The opposite turned out to be true, and I think we're in the same position now with the polls in a frenzy. It's basically saying Trump's got no chance. Biden is surging ahead. The polls are commissioned by people, and the pollsters, whether consciously or unconsciously, lean in a certain direction because the people who commission the polls usually want a certain result. That might sound like, oh, well, yeah, they might ideally want one, but, they really want to find out how things are out there. No, it's not actually. They want to be told what they want to hear. And pollsters, as I say, take that bias into account. So we'll see what happens, but,
well, we're at the stage now where there is actually some early voting going on in America. And what I've heard, and I'm sure both the Republican and Democrat side would want to show whatever narrative that aids them. But certainly when I heard Kayleigh McEnany, I got the surname wrong there, but the press secretary that said from early, looking at the register of polling going on, I think early days, I think it was Florida, she said that there was a sense that Trump was already ahead there. And I think Florida, from what I've seen from the videos of all the people queuing to see him when he did his rally there, and all the various things going on YouTube that obviously get censored, but what I've seen, I think Florida is one of those states that will flip, will be key to what I hope will be a Trump victory. I think Pennsylvania as well would be key as well.
Well, if we're to stick to schedule, then we're pretty much out of time, but I just want to close by asking you somewhat of a personal question. And in terms of the journey that you've been on, that you've described, do you feel it's come at any personal cost or any sacrifice? One of the things that makes individuals very nervous, very apprehensive about exploring alternative versions of the reality that they're living in, no matter how desperately they want to, is what I mentioned earlier, worrying about what friends, family, peers, wider society are going to think. You can do this stuff in private, but then what does it mean if it doesn't change anything about how you live, the direction that you're on, the road you're on?
It's without going into too much detail, it has affected certain relationships. It does make it harder to go and have a good chat with your good mate and talk, because you want to talk about all this interesting stuff, be it the deep state, be it ascension, but you can't, because they're just not on the same wavelength as you. You can meet people who are on the same wavelength, but a lot of my good friends, I'd say, aren't at the moment, and it does affect the relationships to a certain extent, but they're not gone. I have heard from other people who've lost relationships, even with family members, over their beliefs. So it can go down that road, unfortunately. But for me, it hasn't been that long. I'd say in the last year and a bit now. So I think had I woken up, years and years ago, possibly might have been saying something different. But given the short amount of time, relatively, that I've been more awake, it hasn't been too detrimental to relationships. But there has been definitely an effect there. And also, personally, I would say there have been moments where I had felt a little bit ungrounded. Ocean has sort of noticed that as well, in terms of my I think it's necessary when you're going down these rabbit holes to come back out of them and to be just a normal human being and doing all the normal things, because you can get a bit ungrounded if you go too far down these holes and discover a lot of things which are quite difficult to understand and to process, certainly. So I think those two aspects of my own personal journey, I'd say, a word of caution, but I wouldn't change it if I could go back in time. I think we all need to wake up eventually, but I think the time it happened was probably the right time for me, and this is why possibly early on there was a period where I was trying to wake others up. I felt it was my mission, but having matured a bit on that side of things, I've come to realize, I'm looking at my own experiences, that everyone's on a soul journey, and I think there's something going on in the etheric realm or whatever, something that we can't see, but it is influencing when we do wake up. And I think the soul or some higher self is protecting us from understanding things before we're ready, before our consciousness is capable of processing and taking it, because it is quite tough. And for that reason, I think I'm happy to let people to wake up in their own time. And I think that's very important, because if you try and force it on people when they're not ready, I think you can possibly do more harm than good. So for me, I've taken a step back. I'd say probably mid this year, I took a step back from trying to wake others and to become a bit more just cognizant of the fact that they're on their own journey and they will wake up in time, and to let them be, I guess.
Well, Joe, we're going to talk in future on other subjects, but until then, thanks so much for being part of the Freethinkers Report today.
Thank you very much, Greg.